All right. So first up, we have AJ presenting on AJ Jacobs presenting on EA and gratitude.
Thank you, Arushi, and thank you to the other Arushi, aka Aaron. Uh, yeah, I'm talking about EA and gratitude tonight. I am a writer, and I've written several nonfiction books where I try something out like a little life experiment and then write about it. I wrote one where I followed all the rules of the Bible as literally as possible to try to show the follies of fundamentalism. My most recent book is what I'm going to talk briefly about tonight. It's called Thanks a Thousand. And, and the premise is I went around the world and while we could still travel. And I thanked every single person who had even the smallest role in making my morning cup of coffee. And that turned out to be over 1,000 people because I took it wide. I thanked the barista. I flew to South America and thanked the coffee farmer. I thanked the logo designer, the truck driver, the people who made the road so the truck could drive. And the idea was to show how interconnected we all are, how interdependent, how many thousands of people we take for granted. It doesn't take a village to make a cup of coffee, it takes the globe. And this has become very clear with the essential workers in the pandemic, how much we take people for granted. Since I'm a fan of EA, I decided to try to write about the overlaps between gratitude and EA, and I'll tell you just 3 of them tonight. The first is the idea, and I interviewed Will McCaskill, who I'm lucky enough to know from when I first got involved with EA. So he's quoted several times in the book. So the first of the 3 overlaps was the idea that gratitude is an engine for altruism. It increases our altruism. And it makes you want to pay it forward. And I found this on a personal level. For instance, I thanked all of the hundreds of people who provide water, because coffee is 98.8% water. So I had to thank all the people who provide water at the New York Reservoir System, and it made me think of how amazing it is. We can just turn a little spigot and get clean water, and not everyone has that. So, you know, it made me think about what's an EA charity that helps people get water. And I found one, I'll put it in the notes if you want. And there's an interesting study about how thinking about all of the help you get from others increases your charity, your donations. So they had one group think of all of the things that the people did to be successful that they did themselves, like their individual. And then they thought they had people think, a different group think of all the people who contributed to their success, all the people they owed thanks to. And that group was more altruistic, which is good, because there are some people who worry gratitude is sort of like an opiate for the masses. Like it'll make you complacent, like the head of Walmart can say, oh, just be grateful you have a job and not give any raises. But it turns out that most people find gratitude to be a spark to thinking about other people and being more altruistic. The second, more quickly, is I talked to Will about, should I be drinking coffee at all? Should I be going to my little cafe and paying $3 for a cup of coffee? And his argument was, yes, I am allowed to drink my morning cup of coffee, because we shouldn't deprive ourselves too much of the little pleasures, because then we need something to motivate ourselves to do good in the world, and those small pleasures might be crucial. And we talked about, you know, the phrase penny wise and pound foolish. So like, you know, you save 10 cents on cereal, but you spend thousands on a sports car. So he encouraged me and others to be penny foolish and pound wise. So spend money on those little things that make us happy, like a cup of coffee, the cheap things. But if you're, going to buy a car or buy a house, then you think small. Then you try to downsize. And finally, I asked Will what he's grateful for, and he had an interesting answer, which was he said, sometimes I'm just grateful that I have arms and hands. And he said that it's important to be grateful for those things that don't even occur to you, which I thought was a lovely notion. So that is my mini lightning presentation on gratitude and EA. And thank you, of course, for watching. And thank Steve Wozniak for inventing the Apple. Steve Jobs gets all the credit, but Wozniak, he was the guy who did the real tech stuff. All right, I'll stop there.
Woo, way to go, AJ. That was great. That's fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you, AJ.
I'll let my moderator, are there any questions?
Yes, so what is the EA charity that you mentioned that's related to water, and what EA organization provided the write-up on that?
Oh, it was Will McCaskill's suggestion when I asked him for a water charity, and he suggested, you know what, I'll look up the exact name and put it in the chat, but it was something like Containers for Clean Water. It was a company that made water filters for developing countries so that they didn't have to go to the wells.
Okay, cool. And do you have stats on the effectiveness of gratitude on doing good?
I love that question, and that's a very EA question, and I wish I did. I mean, I looked long and hard for actual metrics, and but it seems a lot of the gratitude research is a little fuzzy and feel good with, and we're in a replication crisis, as you probably know, so I'm not sure I would trust the metrics anyway. So it is my belief that it increases altruism, and it's certainly from a data point of one of me, it does help me be more effectively altruistic.
I like that you mentioned the replicability crisis. That's definitely the biggest crisis we're going through right now. So really,
it's the only one.
Paying attention to the major things in life. Yeah.
Thank you.
Another question, do you think that there are ever downsides to gratitude or situations in which cultivating gratitude might be a bad idea? And relatedly, were there any interesting objections to the idea of your book?
That is interesting. I mean, I had one objection that I never heard anyone else make, but like, is gratitude just a really privileged thing? Like, when you say just, all these things to be grateful for, what would I say to someone living in sub-Saharan Africa who has nothing? What should they be like keeping a gratitude journal? And I don't know the answer. I mean, my hope is everyone has some positive moments in their life and that they can latch onto them, but it's a moral question that's complicated and I don't know the answer. So I'm my harshest critic on that one.
Okay, I think that is all of the questions. Thank you so much, AJ,
Great, thank you.
for that lovely presentation.
All right, can you all see this?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so let's go for it. So I'm going to be talking today, I'm James, and I'm talking today about what a moral circle is. This is a term that you might have seen around EA a lot. So the basic idea where it arises is that it's easier or maybe more common historically for people to care about individuals who are very close to them. But if you start to look at individuals that are more different, more distant from you, then it becomes less common to have altruistic concern for those individuals. So for example, maybe a few thousand years ago, people cared mostly about individuals in their close kin groups. later on people in their tribes, their city-states, of their ethnicity, of their religious group. And now we're getting to a point where more and more people, at least theoretically, say that all humans matter. And hopefully we can go a step beyond that and get people to care about non-human animals as well, or all forms of sentient life. What does distant mean? Well, it's a little bit hard to pin down. There was a really interesting post on the EA forum recently about this. We can talk about maybe multiple dimensions of a moral circle. So there's temporal distance, there's maybe genetic similarity, but that's not really the focus of this talk. I want to go into something more basic, which is just, let's say we define the moral circle with this sentence. Our moral circle refers to all the entities we care about. Well, this seems like it kind of captures something about what we want the moral circle to refer to. But what do we mean by entities? What do we mean by we? And what do we mean by care? So I'm going to address all of those, or attempt to. So first, what do we mean by entities? Well, it really depends on what we're trying to accomplish by breaking down the world into different constituent parts. So this whole framework kind of supposes that there's things out there in the world that can accrue harms or benefits, or that have experiences or interests or rights. And this is really presupposing a kind of consequentialist framework. And maybe that's okay, because like personally, I find consequentialism pretty compelling. But I think it's important to be aware of that. Some edge cases that are a little bit interesting. Before encountering EA, I was pretty interested in teaching Latin as a career. Is the Latin language an entity? Can it be harmed by me not teaching it? Maybe it seems like the sort of thing that maybe we want to be like a theoretical member of the moral circle, but something that we don't actually want to extend moral concern to, independently of what interests humans might have in the Latin language. What about something like love? I think we all care about love, but not in the sense that love can accrue harms or benefits or has interests. Yes, the basic point here is that even at this basic level, we're kind of packing in some assumptions about ethics. Now, more interestingly, maybe, what do we mean by caring? So two main axes that conceptions of the moral circle can break down on are attitudinal conceptions of the moral circle and behavioral conceptions. So when we're interested about attitudes, we'll be asking questions about, like, if you were having a philosophical conversation with someone, what sorts of beings do they think have interests, right? It might be a little tricky because people's beliefs can be probabilistic. So is there a cutoff point for when you think that insects are part of the moral circle, if you're like 70% sure that they have interests? Or is there like no cutoff point and this is just like continuous range that we're talking about? In behavioral conceptions, we're more interested in what people actually do in their lives to protect the interests of other beings. So do we act in the interests of insects, right? Do we act in the interests of like what insects actually want or need or desire, or do we act in what we think their interests are? This is a really important point because historically, there's been a number of groups that others have claimed to care about, probably truthfully, but without actually understanding what's good for those individuals or what they desire. So in terms of what conception might be most interesting or important to people who want to improve the long-term future of the world, I think some things to bear in mind is that it might become easier to actually act on our beliefs if things don't go catastrophically wrong in the future. This might be because it's less costly to make trade-offs, right? So it's easier for me to act in the best interests of cattle if I'm able to get something that's chemically identical to a burger through cellular agriculture, for example. It might also be easier to understand what the interests of different individuals are in the future. I put a little asterisk there because I think normative questions might still be really hard to resolve, although hopefully we can make some philosophical progress. By normative questions, I mean things that are independent from the state of the world. So the sort of thing I think could be easier to answer in the future is if we think that insects' experiences and senses of pleasure and pain matter, then what actually causes an insect to feel pleasure or pain? harder question would be like, does an insect have an interest in its species continuing in a certain way or existing in its ancestral habitat or something like that? Another axis this breaks down along is impartiality or partiality. So this just refers to whether or not we're giving the holder of these attitudes or the subject of these behaviors a privileged position, right? So I think most people, maybe all people, are partial to themselves and their loved ones, right? So it's not the case that I just donate all my money to charity. I probably wouldn't do that even if I wasn't concerned about these questions of burnout or being penny wise, right? Because I care about like the lives of my loved ones more than the lives of other people. Even though I'm in effective altruism, I do care about other people to a good extent when I'm engaging in this mode of impartial concern. So Singer, in his book, The Expanding Circle, that kind of laid out this idea of the moral circle, was talking about impartial concern. These are the sorts of questions that are relevant to a society, because when we're deciding like where to build a bridge, it might be compelling to me that a certain location is more convenient for my commute. But if I'm raising that in a town hall discussion, that's not going to be compelling to other people if it's the case that a different location is going to be convenient for the majority of commuters, right? Also, even when we're talking about impartial concern, are we allowing for like moral circle inclusion to be about what people would theoretically do if they're not inconvenienced? So what I mean by that is, let's say that theoretically, if it would never inconvenience me at all to help insects, then I'd help insects. But if it inconveniences me even a small amount, then I'm always going to prioritize my own interests. If that's my attitude, am I really including insects in my moral circle? Seems maybe not to be the case. However, as I said, in the future, it might be easier to advance other people's interests or other beings' interests without these trade-offs. So maybe a more strictly impartial definition is more helpful to us there. One last way this can differ. So we can talk about moral circle inclusion as asking yes or no questions. Do you have some amount of moral concern for another being, or do you not? Or we can talk about moral circle inclusion as more of a continuous process. How much do you care about other individuals? Or how much, to what extent would you prioritize their interests and trade-offs with your loved ones or more groups that are closer to you, right? This sort of continuous range is what's used in some parts of the psychology literature as the moral expansiveness scale, which is pretty interesting. One thing to note about the scale is that it does conflate partial conceptions of the moral circle and impartial conceptions a little bit in how its questions are laid out, which might be something that we like or don't like, depending on what we're after in asking these questions that arrive at the scale. And lastly, what do we mean by we? So sometimes we're talking about the moral circle of individuals, but most of the time we're more interested in the moral circle of communities or all of humanity. If that's the case, how do we arrive at the moral circle of a community from the moral circle of individuals? Do we have some process of aggregating the opinions or the behaviors of all the individuals together, or are we looking at more community level properties? Like, for example, in the US's Constitution or other statements of principle, is there anything there that evidences concern for non-human animals, right? Or in the policies of the United States, do we have policies that protect the interests of non-human animals? Either interests as we see them or their actual interests, right? In the long run future, I think that the dependency of future policies on previous policies will maybe come apart a little bit, and the attitudes of decision makers could be more relevant to what future societies actually do. But I think this is a tough question. I do want to shout out to the Non-Human Rights Project, who has a theory of change where by making statements or policies that protect the rights of non-human animals, they think that that will actually produce attitude change and future policies that are even more beneficial So I think that's a very interesting take on things. So concluding thoughts, I think it's very unclear which of these definitions or ways of conceiving the moral circle will be more useful. I think there's a lot of weird edge cases to consider. So for example, let's say that I think that if a insect could feel pleasure or pain, I'd want to really do as much as I can to prevent its suffering and help it live a really good life. But I don't think that an insect can have experiences like that. Would we say that I am including insects in my moral circle? Under some of these definitions, yeah, but is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure. It comes down to your opinions about what sorts of processes are going to produce good outcomes for sentient life in the future, and what parts of like current attitudes or current societies should we pay attention to in order to bring about those good outcomes. So thank you, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Awesome, awesome, awesome talk.
Thank you so much, James. That was really great. So just a quick note, that talk did run a little over time, so I'm allotting 10 minutes for each speaker, and that'll be for like the talk and Q&A. So if you run over with the talk, then we'll cut it out of the Q&A. I think we don't have any time for questions for this. So we are going to move on to the next speaker, Cameron, and then after Cameron speaks, we'll have a 2-minute just break to like get water, stretch before the next speaker. All right, so next up is Cameron Meyer-Shorb speaking about habitat level wild animal welfare improvements.
Thanks, Arushi. Can I share my screen? Looks like I can. Presenting. All right, hi everyone. I'm going to present some ideas I've been bouncing around about ways we could improve wild animal welfare at the habitat level. These are not things that we've explored at Wild Animal Initiative yet, but I'm using you guys as my test case to see if this is something worth exploring more. So as you probably know, we should really help wild animals. They exist in huge numbers. There's about 1,000 vertebrates for every human alive on Earth. So those are all sentient animals that we know need help. They live in the wild, often in quite challenging conditions that are more similar to things we would call poverty in a human circumstance than the comfortable lives that you and I lead with grocery stores and air conditioning. And unfortunately, those animals can't ask for our help, but it seems that we would have a moral duty to provide the help that they would ask for if they could. We can't just stand by and let them suffer alone. There are different ways that we could help wild animals. In particular, I'd like to think about it in terms of different scales. The oldest way of helping wild animals is at the individual scale. With animal hospitals or veterinary medicine, you help one animal at a time. The good thing about this is it's really easy to know when you have helped an animal. The bad thing is it's really hard to help many animals through these individualized methods. So recently, we've been developing population level improvements to wild animal welfare. This is a picture of some bait that the CDC has employed that is laced with a vaccine against rabies that has protected entire fox populations against rabies. The good thing about that is that you can help many foxes at one time. But the bad thing is you don't necessarily know how that affects other animals in the system. It might be good for foxes, but bad for the mice that foxes eat. So ideally, our animal welfare interventions would eventually help entire communities of animals at a time. That is, benefit all the animals in a system, at least on net, make a better world once you take into account everyone that is affected. Unfortunately, we don't have good ways of doing this yet. Novel ecosystems might be the ideal approach to this. You can imagine planting plants and assembling animal species and altering abiotic conditions to optimize the perfect conditions for everyone to live the happiest possible life. And I think this is a nice fantasy to keep in mind as we think about the long-termist implications of wild animal welfare. But in the meantime, habitat restoration is more practical. Habitat restoration is the process of taking a landscape that used to be dominated by humans and restoring it to what we would consider a more natural state. For example, the prairie, the tall grass prairie that you see at the left here, was actually planted on top of a tilled soybean field, like the one you see on the right. So the principles I'm about to describe would really apply to any kind of land use change. It could apply to changing from soybean to corn to cotton production, but I'm going to talk about habitat restoration just to keep things simple. So one thing that I think could help wild animals is if we went about strategically, preferentially restoring different habitats. In most areas of the world, if you wanted to plant a forest, there are many different kinds of forests that you could plant. So for example, throughout the tropics, it's very common to plant oil palm plantations like the one on the right, but you could also conceivably plant a diverse native forest like the one on the left. And the reason I think this is important for wild animal welfare is that even though these forests exist in the same area of the world, they support vastly different animal communities, different kinds of animals in really different numbers. So I think this presents an opportunity to make a choice. When we plant a forest, are we going to plant one that has more or less animal happiness in it overall? Of course, we would need to do a little more research to decide the total amount of happiness in each system, but I don't think it would require that much research given how different the total populations are here. You just need a sense of the sizes of the animal populations in each system, the approximate breakdown across different types of animals that have different kinds of lives. And then you would need to know for each of those categories, do those lives tend to be positive on the whole or negative on the whole? The preferential restoration approach has several advantages over approaches that work at the individual or the population scale. So in terms of identifying which interventions we actually want to recommend, it's much easier to predict which ones will work because it affects a whole landscape at a time. And we tend to understand these systems pretty well. We know what animals tend to live in what kinds of forests. And as I was describing before, because the differences are so large between these choices we have, we don't actually need to know precisely what every single animal's life is like in extreme detail. We just need to know which system would support better lives on the whole. We just need to be able to rank them. Then when it comes to implementing these interventions, this is a relatively cheap and durable thing to do. You know, if you were to go out and try to bandage every wing of every injured bird in the world, that would be expensive and time consuming. But planting forests is cheap. It's something we know how to do. And once you have a forest in place, it tends to stay a forest for a long time. And then finally, I think the most exciting part of this is that it's easy to imagine how we could institutionalize this, how we could incorporate this wild animal welfare program into existing policies. For example, you might know in the US, we have agricultural conservation easement programs, which pay farmers to take unproductive farmland and turn it into natural land, like that soy to prairie conversion we saw before. You could imagine altering that program so that it incentivizes farmers to turn their land into habitats that are better for wild animals as opposed to habitats that are worse for them. I think this kind of approach is going to happen at really massive scales over the next couple decades as we try to sequester carbon by planting forests all across the world. There's schemes like REDD+, which pay developing countries in particular to turn their marginal pasture land into forests to capture carbon. And as we go about this process of transforming our Earth's surface in pursuit of a better control of the climate, we could use that same effort to make it a better world for animals as well. So that is my idea for helping wild animals at the community scale. I'd love to hear your questions.
Bravo, bravo. Great image to end on.
Thank you so much, Kim. That's fantastic. All right, we have a couple questions coming in. First, can you speak to what human actions you think have the most negative impacts on wild animals?
I think it's really hard to say. I think that it's really important to recognize how much uncertainty we have about wild animals and their lives right now, and which ones live good lives, which ones live bad lives. I think the way we affect wild animals the most is through habitat destruction and land use change. So that's definitely the way we're having the biggest impact. It's hard for me to tell which land use changes are worse than others, but it's almost certainly in that category. And of course, climate change is its own meta kind of land use change category, right? We're going to have massive amounts of tundra turning into boreal forest. And I don't actually know if it's better to live in a tundra or a boreal forest, but it's certainly a huge change.
Mm-hmm. Do you do you have any sense of how these interventions you listed relate to ending climate change?
Yeah, so as I was mentioning at the end, the ideal here would be to harness our efforts to end climate change and direct them in a way that simultaneously benefits wild animals. Of course, there are times when there might be big trade-offs where maybe the forest that is best at sequestering carbon is worse for animals, and then we'll have to have hard conversations. But it's a big world, and I think there will be many, many opportunities where we find that we can have positive sum solutions that help both climate and animals. And I think those are the ones that wild animal welfare advocates should be prioritizing.
Awesome. How do you avoid using the appeal to nature fallacy when deciding to restore habitats?
Yeah, so the reason I chose to focus on habitat restoration is that it's something that already happens a lot. A lot of people are interested in, and I think wild animal welfare advocates should make an effort to work with existing systems and movements and build bridges whenever possible. And so it's definitely true that some people pursue habitat restoration in a way that really embodies the appeal to nature fallacy, where they think, oh, you know, the problem with this soybean field is that it doesn't look exactly like this land used to look in 1492, and we need to bring it back exactly to 1492, and that would be sort of an arbitrary way to think about the landscape. But fortunately, restoration ecology seems to be a discipline that has, I would say, one of the most sophisticated understandings of the appeal to nature fallacy, because restorationists have tried so hard for so long to figure out, wait, what exactly are we trying to build here? What are we, why are we picking these plants? Like, should we choose 1492 or should we choose 10,000 BC? So this is actually a community that has had those conversations. And I think that people that are really involved in habitat restoration recognize that it's not as simple as just going back to this mythical, state of nature. It's a matter of choosing what do we as a community want to accomplish and what kinds of landscapes will serve those ends.
And last question, if you could know the answer to one question about wild animal suffering, what question would it be?
It would be which wild animals are sentient, along the lines of James's talk. I want to know which ones can feel pain and joy, and I want to help them first.
So thank you so much, Cam. There are actually quite a few more questions that came in for you in the chat. So if you want to answer those like over the chat later, that would be great. I think now we're going to take a little 2-minute like water stretch break. So we'll come back here at let's say 2:55.
Should we move on?
All right,
7:55.
yeah, I think let's get started again. So next up we have Jay Shooster talking about advancing fish welfare through false advertising lawsuits.
Thanks, Paul.
Take it away, Jay.
What?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so unfortunately, I have to follow those hilarious jokes, so don't, get your expectations too high here. So I am Jay Shooster. I work with a public interest law firm called the Richmond Law Group, and I work there as a senior animal welfare legal fellow, which is a title I actually picked myself, which is why it sounds so fancy. So I hope you like it. And I focus at the firm on false advertising litigation, in particular against companies that exploit animals. And some of the companies I've sued would be companies like Tyson Foods, Unilever, Kraft Foods, a lot of the biggest food companies in the world. And I also work with and advise a variety of animal organizations on law and policy issues, including I worked with the Non-Human Rights Project that was mentioned in the previous talk for a long time. And our practice historically has focused on industrial agribusinesses that exploit land animals, but we are now moving to focus on fish companies or companies that use fish in their products, both because of neglectedness reasons and scale, which we can talk about further. But before I really dive in, no pun intended, I just came up with that joke on the spot. Some of the jokes are actually written into the script, but that was spontaneous. As a lawyer, I do need to say before I get started that I'm just speaking on behalf of myself and not all of the world's aquatic animals. That was a scripted joke. So, so basically, the fundamental premise of my work is this idea that a lot of things, in fact, most of the horrible things we do to animals in our ecosystem and workers that are inherent evils in the production of animal products, most of these things are actually lawful. The substantive production practices are lawful. But what we can do to hold these companies accountable, even if we can't necessarily enforce the law against them directly for harming animals, we could at least sue them for lying about not harming animals or lying about being sustainable. And in the context of fish products, we focus on right now about 4 key types of claims. One, animal welfare claims or humane claims, sustainable claims or environmental claims, wild caught claims that you may see on some products, and natural claims. And we try to work in, and I can explain further, I don't have enough time to get into it now, how all of these things intersect with animal welfare. But we basically have used a variety of research and consumer surveys that allow us to argue in court that consumers think some of these terms, at least, have certain animal welfare implications to them, and that companies need to live up to all the reasonable expectations that consumers may have about when various products are marketed with humane, sustainable, natural, et cetera, these types of terms. And we use a variety of tools to identify when companies are lying about these things, everything from testing the actual products in laboratories for different chemicals, looking at companies' own published standards. For example, we have a case, we've worked against one company that said that they're humane, but the only standards they pointed to were for environmental sustainability. And we were able to determine they actually had no standards at all for the welfare of the fishes. This is also kind of like knowledge of the industry that we rely on. For example, we've learned that rainbow trout and Atlantic salmon are always farmed no matter what. And so when you see companies marketing their products as farmed or as wild caught rainbow trout, we just know automatically that is a lie. And we use public records requests. You may have heard of the Freedom of Information Act or FOIA. And then do a lot of just open source research, what I would call deep Googling, looking at news articles, job postings for positions at these companies, academic or industry talks that officials at these companies have given, their corporate websites, et cetera. And we were able to find through really deep digging through all these sources that companies are not actually living up to their expectations on animal welfare or the environment, et cetera. And the last thing I just want to talk about is our cases broadly fall into 2 buckets: class actions and on behalf of thousands or even millions of consumers, and nonprofit cases on behalf of organizations like, for example, Animal Equality, who some of you may know is a client of ours and is an effective, or has been listed as an effective animal advocacy organization. And what we do is through these false advertising statutes, every state has a false advertising statute, we can hold these companies accountable in a variety of ways. One, we can seek damages on behalf of all of the basically monetary compensation for all the consumers that were misled and spent money on these attributes that they weren't actually getting from the products. And then we can also seek what's called injunctive relief, which is a court order to make the company stop marketing their products falsely. And finally, we can get declaratory relief, which is an order from the court that says, this fish company is engaging in false advertising. And then we get attorney's fees for our work. In all of these cases, we can get paid. Basically, almost all of these laws provide for, when we win our cases, we get to be compensated. Basically, the law tries to incentivize folks like us or nonprofits to be able to bring these actions. And what we try to do in ideal cases is actually leverage all of these forms of relief that we can get through a lawsuit to get some things we can't necessarily get through a lawsuit, which is primarily to work with, to encourage companies to actually improve their practices directly for animals, instead of just paying out damages to consumers or stopping their lies. And with that, I'll turn it over for Q&A.
Woo, I like the scripted jokes.
Thanks.
If you have any questions,
And
definitely add them in the
unscripted
chat.
jokes were both great. Thank you so much, Jay.
Questions. Not everyone at once.
I have a question right off the bat, which is like, how successful is it? Like, how much of a deterrent is this really to some of the large companies, especially, I guess, I don't know, if you're a billion-dollar company and you have to pay like a $1 million settlement, like, is it really enough of a sting?
Yeah, so these basically the fundamental premise of the work is also that these companies' brands are really crucial. Being able to market themselves as sustainable or humane is really important to their continued success in the market, and they see that way for themselves. And so, to the extent that we either are preventing them from marketing themselves in that way, or through the litigation itself, tarnishing their reputation, that it can be a very effective deterrent. And even as recently as this week, we saw a law review article written by a very prominent defense law firm that represents a lot of the world's largest food companies that was imploring the world's biggest food companies to stop making these claims because the Richmond Law Group is filing all these cases and they're going to come after you. So I think we are actually beginning to see companies wake up and start trying to, are actually really cognizant of the work that we're doing and changing their behavior accordingly.
Nice. We had a question up above that was just asked by Elliot, which is how much can companies get away with under the puffery defense? And I don't know what puffery means, so I really want you to answer this question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of companies are allowed to make certain claims that are just determined to be right off the bat. You can't sue over them. And a classic example would be saying that their fish products are the best. And the courts have basically held that this is not a claim capable of being proven true or false. It's so vague and so obviously silly, or it just no reasonable consumer would rely on such a claim. Any reasonable person would know that, of course, the company is just puffing, we call it, just kind of just saying things to make themselves sound good. And yeah, unfortunately, they can get away with a lot under these types of arguments. But the courts really varies from court to court. But companies have at least argued that they can simply say things like, we are committed to enshrining animal welfare in every fiber of our being, and say all sorts of like kind of weird qualifiers that lead most people to think, oh, this company really does care about animal welfare. But the companies say, oh, well, we never actually promised that we actually are going to do anything with these values that we have. And so, yeah, companies at least try to get away with a lot. A lot of these cases are very novel, and it remains to be seen exactly what they can and can't get away with.
Do you look at the biggest possible payouts when you're looking at cases, or the most winnable cases?
We have a variety of metrics that we look at in deciding to bring a case. Both scale and neglectedness, classic kind of EA considerations come into it. But we also weigh, we have a diverse portfolio of cases. Some of them we think may do better on scale and neglectedness, but will have very little in the way of a financial impact on the industry or a financial benefit to our work. And others may do worse on scale and neglectedness, but may have a very significant potential for financial returns and frankly, a bigger hammer to be wielded against the industry. And yeah, we have a mix of cases that kind of fall across all these different dimensions, but that's certainly a significant factor that we take into consideration, even though some of our cases we don't expect to ever see any money off of for one reason or another.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what's your track record on these cases?
So it's really still in their experimental phases. These cases take years to resolve. And we've settled a handful of cases and we've lost a handful of cases. And so it's really, I don't know, maybe about 50-50 right now. We haven't taken a case all the way through to trial. I think only one animal-related false advertising case in history has ever gone all the way through to trial. It's very rare that any false advertising cases actually resolve in a legal victory for the plaintiffs. It's almost always a favorable outcome, is almost always a settlement. And so, yeah, I would say we're about 50-50 so far.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk, Jay. And there are a few more questions in the chat if you just want to answer them in the chat later. Our next talk will be from Kenneth on family planning as an EA cause area.
Thanks, Archie. Before I begin, Can I just point out, for the sake of everyone, that there's a turkey on the call now, and I think it just needed to be acknowledged. It's pretty awesome. I've never presented to a turkey before, so if I could win it over, I feel like then I've done my job. I'm gonna share the screen. I have some slides. See if I could get this to work. Can people see a nice, friendly lady with an innocent child?
No, we cannot.
No. Oh, I didn't hit the share button. How about now?
Now we can.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, I'm talking about family planning as an EA cause area. And one way I like to think about this is, imagine that in developing countries, women could take a pill and it could prevent them from dying early. It could also free up time for them to continue in school, to care more for their children, to advance more in their careers. Well, as you may have guessed, in fact, this pill exists. We often call it the pill, and oral contraceptives, as well as implants, injectables, the ring, and other forms of modern contraceptives have been around for many years in developed countries, and they really transformed societies. However, in developing countries, there's still limited access to modern forms of contraceptives. So if we look at the fertility preferences of women of reproductive age, we see in low and middle income countries that 923 million women want to avoid pregnancy. Of those, 218 million are not using a modern form of contraceptive. And that leads to 111 unintended pregnancies per year. So that's a bad thing. There are a lot of bad things in the world. And in effective altruism, we try to prioritize and see what we should be working on. And I think that in family planning, there are reasons to believe that there's many benefits that make it a particularly important cause area. You can look at it from a standpoint of improving subjective well-being. There's a bit of research that's been conducted on enabling people to have more control over their fertility and increases in subjective well-being. You can look at it from an income improvement standpoint. There's more research that has been conducted on that, showing that by providing adolescent girls and women access to family planning, it increases the amount of time that they stay in school, and it makes them more likely to continue in the formal labor force. And then finally, what's most clear is that improving access to family planning can have a huge impact on health outcomes. So looking at that some more, if you look at low-income countries, and really the same is true for middle-income countries, preterm births or basically maternal deaths due to pregnancy are the 8th highest cause of death. In fact, there are 300,000 women that die every year due to pregnancy. And of those, 30% of them are due to unintended pregnancies. So if you were just to enable people to realize their family planning intentions, you could prevent one of the largest sources of death in developing countries. So in effective altruism, we often use the 3-factor framework. It could be considered a little bit simplistic, but I think it's a helpful heuristic. And I think from my perspective, and obviously there's a lot more data and information that could be shared, but family planning indisputably is important if you look at it from the perspective, for example, of scale and potential for impact. You might question as to whether it is tractable. Family planning, you tend to think that it involves getting commodities to women in remote locations, and that could be quite challenging in terms of developing the supply chain. But in fact, when you look at the numbers and you talk to women in low and middle income countries, The top reason why they are not using family planning is due to concerns around side effects, concerns around health risks, and inconvenience. Now, in some cases, there are legitimate reasons for them to be concerned, but often the problem is that there are myths that pervade communities in low information environments. So for example, in Kenya, a study found that people found that the pill can thought that the pill can cause delivery of children with 2 heads and no skin. And you see these kind of outlandish beliefs persist intentionally in some cases because people are trying, for cultural reasons, are opposed to family planning, and other times unintentionally just due to spreading inaccurate information. Fortunately, there is a low-cost way to improve information available on contraceptives and therefore to lead to better family planning outcomes. And that is using the radio. So in Africa, 3 out of 4 households have access to radios, and it is one of the most trusted forms of media. Beyond that, randomized controlled trial was just conducted by Innovations for Poverty Action on an intervention conducted by Development Media International, where they presented information about family planning methods on the radio. And they found that this led to a 5 percentage point increase in the use of contraceptives in Burkina Faso. Now, if you scaled that program, it would mean that for just $6.50 per woman, you could, basically you can get an additional woman to be using contraceptives for just $6.50. So that is quite tractable, assuming that those results can be replicated. And then finally on neglectedness. Now, there's a lot of great work that has been done in the area of family planning, and donors are active here, like the Gates Foundation, USAID, and DFID. In terms of sticking to results from randomized controlled trials on this information awareness campaign, there's less organizations working in that space. There's DMI, or Development Media International, which I just mentioned. And then I've just co-founded Family Empowerment Media. So neglectedness you could look at in different ways, but in terms of that specific area, I think that there's more room for activity. So that's my case for family planning as a EA cause area. I think that clearly the answer is not as simple as just getting people to take a pill or some other form of contraceptive. There's a lot more involved in getting people access to contraception. However, it is a tractable problem. I think it's important, and I think there's space for additional work to be done. So thank you, and looking forward to your questions.
Nice, amazing, amazing work.
Thank you so much, Kenneth.